a wave of coronavirus-related evictions could lead to a spike in homelessness across the country. I'm going to give you an example. We're going to focus on Boston, where some say the situation is dire. A new study from Boston-based grassroots organizations City Life and MIT shows that just how rather communities of color will be overwhelmingly impacted by this. So I want to bring in Tim Logan. He's a business reporter for the Boston Globe. And Tim, I want to give people some background who may not sort of be aware of what happened once the coronavirus started to spread in this country and businesses started to shut down. In many municipalities, they put a freeze on evictions. There was a recognition that a number of people would be financially stressed, they may not be able to go to work, and it would be unfair to evict them in the middle of a pandemic. But those freezes have to end at some point. And according to this study, and according to your article, when those freezes lift, minority communities will be perhaps impacted the most in Boston. Is that a good snapshot?
Yeah, I think it is. So yes, in Massachusetts, like many states, the legislature enacted an eviction moratorium in April. Here it runs through the middle of August. And it has basically put a freeze on evictions for the last few months, which a lot of people say have kept a lot of people in their homes. We've had, like many places, we've had enormous job loss. We've lost more than 1 million jobs in Massachusetts in the last few months. A lot of those are lower income, hourly kind of workers who struggle to pay rent in an expensive city like this to begin with. The moratorium here it's kept a lot of people in their homes, and the impacts in general have been hardest felt most here in lower income and particularly non-white communities in Boston. City Life partnered with MIT to produce a report. This was in the works long before the coronavirus epidemic, that shows sort of where evictions have been most common in Boston in recent years. They took 3 years of data from our city's housing court, and they found that it's vastly disproportionate in lower income communities of color in the city. The same places that have been most of the coronavirus.
You're sort of breaking up a little bit, but in the article, you identify individuals, and it really sort of brings the story home. We're talking about, a senior citizen living alone who really needed a break on her rent, and now she is spending this time calling up to get information about homeless shelters because she doesn't know if she'll be able to pay the rent and perhaps the back rent once the pandemic lifts. That's terrifying.
Yeah, it is. I mean, look, this is both an economic crisis and a public health crisis, and Massachusetts, like a lot of places, are basically ordering people to stay home to avoid spreading the disease, right? So that at the same time, people are struggling to pay the rent, and people are pretty scared. I mean, certainly a lot of people have, like I said, have lost jobs, have lost income. This is already a very expensive place to live. Rents here have been high. We've had a housing crisis for years. So all this stuff is coming together, and it has a lot of people very concerned about what's going to happen starting in August.
Yeah. Let's talk. So you just brought up something about, many people have said there is an affordable housing crisis in this country long before COVID-19. But the study looks at the impact that this pandemic could have on this crisis, the ways in which it could exacerbate it. What does the study say?
So what the study says is that even before coronavirus, right, the evictions were disproportionately high in lower income neighborhoods of color in Boston. Roxbury and Mattapan, which are the two neighborhoods of Boston with the largest African-American populations, 7 times as likely to see an eviction as white neighborhoods in other parts of the city. That's even after adjusting for income. So those neighborhoods are already being hit hardest by the housing crisis. They are also the neighborhoods that have seen the most job loss, and in many places, the neighborhoods have seen the most coronavirus cases. So it's logical to think that when evictions start up again, they will hit hardest in these neighborhoods. The places that were filed, the evictions that were filed before the freeze took effect in April were also disproportionately in these neighborhoods. So I think there's a lot of concern that we're going to see a housing crisis hit hardest in the places that have the least resources in Boston.
Yeah. And I know, people say, well, if you can't afford to live in a certain community, then maybe you should move to another community. But it's not that easy. Right now, as we pointed out, there are protections in place. There's a moratorium on evictions. And in a lot of places, too, there you are being allowed to kind of put your rent on hold because of this pandemic. But eventually, those rents need to be paid. And for some landlords, it may mean, you've got to make up for the back rent, which means they're going to add a little bit extra onto your monthly payment. And if you have to find a new place to live, you have to find sort of first and last and deposit, and maybe you're not working. Let's talk about in Boston right now. What are the protections that are in place for people, and what will happen when they go away? I mean, do people even know?
At the moment, nobody really knows. I mean, there is the eviction moratorium in Massachusetts runs through August 18th at the moment. It could be extended. The governor can extend it, I think, 45 days at a time on his own, and people are starting to push him to do that. There's also legislation in the state legislature that would extend it for a year, and that would also create some funding. Like you mentioned, landlords are in a tough spot here too, especially small landlords that don't have deep pockets. They need that rent money to pay their own bills, and they're in the middle of this too. So there's some money in this bill, this proposal, that would help small landlords, particularly if they agree to keep rents in check or give people a break. But, and then there are various state and city programs. Last week, the governor pumped another $20 million into the state's biggest rental relief program. The city of Boston has an $8 million program. But in the grand scheme of things, that's kind of small money. There's a separate report found that once the expanded unemployment benefits run out, which is a whole other part of this problem, the extra $600 a month that unemployment benefits that many people are receiving, that they estimate that that's filling right now about $120 million a month gap in what people can pay for housing in Massachusetts. So once those go away, this crisis gets even worse. So a lot of people are saying, well, there's not enough money at the state and local level to address this, and that there needs to be some sort of federal solution, some combination of a moratorium and rent relief funds. There was a bill as part of the HEROES Act, was passed by the House a couple months ago. They would set aside $100 billion in federal rental relief while also putting an eviction moratorium nationally for 12 months. That bill is currently tied up in the Senate. It was passed by the House Democrats. Republicans have other ideas. There's a couple other efforts in Washington. Senator Elizabeth Warren last week filed a bill with some colleagues that would create a 12-month eviction moratorium nationally without any rental relief money. The Democrats in Congress are starting to push on this. There's a lot of advocacy around it, and we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, I think kind of the frustrating thing, I think for many people is kind of what you just described as municipalities and the federal government working just like a few months ahead. I mean, that doesn't give you a lot of faith or a lot of stability if you don't know if that extra $600 is going to come or not. And that's the difference between you being able to pay your rent and not pay your rent. There's a definite need for sort of long-term planning and protection. And like you point out, you can say to people, you don't need to pay your rent, but there are landlords who are depending on this to pay the bank. Well, then the bank has to work out something with the landlords. It can't any sort of protection for people who are on the edge can't exist in a vacuum. It has to be part of a number of puzzle pieces to complete the picture.
Yeah, I mean, this is really complicated, and there's enormous amount of uncertainty, right? We're talking about things that are going to end in a matter of weeks, and generally speaking, Washington and state legislatures don't move that fast. So, I mean, it's a real mess, and I'm not sure that anybody has a handle on all of it. But in the middle of it, you have people like some of the people we spoke to for our story who are, trying to navigate all this. Senior citizens thinking about homeless shelters, trying to figure out how to scratch together enough money to pay the rent when they or their family members have lost work. And there's no jobs to be found right now. So it's a real mess.
It really is. The article is really good. You could tell the story through numbers, but you tell the story through people, and it truly is heartbreaking. Hopefully we don't sort of wrap up one pandemic and find ourselves dealing with another. Tim, thank you so much.
Thank you.